It was a bright morning, yet the house felt heavy with silence. Margaret, turning 65 that day, moved slowly through the rooms of her home, her steps deliberate, as if each footfall were a drumbeat marking the final chapter of her life, or at least the life she had known. She had always been the backbone of her family, the quiet laborer who sacrificed her own desires for the comfort and success of her children. For decades she had cooked, cleaned, advised, forgiven, and carried burdens that were never hers alone. Yet in the quiet of her kitchen, as sunlight fell in fractured patterns across the oak floor, she realized she had been invisible in her own life. The smiles she once believed were for her were now for the inheritance, the property, the fleeting perks she had provided. It had been months of planning, months of careful, secret preparation. She had enlisted the help of Thomas, an old friend she trusted more than anyone, who had a knack for orchestrating the impossible. Together, they had staged a scenario so convincing that even the most skeptical eye would be fooled. Emergency responders had been called, a subtle message sent to neighbors, and a mysterious accident orchestrated. To the outside world, Margaret had simply vanished, and then, tragically, she had died. The news traveled fast. By the afternoon, her children were summoned back to the house, faces pale, eyes glistening, or so she would later witness. From her hidden vantage, Margaret watched her adult children gather. She saw her eldest, Richard, enter first, his tie slightly askew, his eyes scanning the living room with a mix of sorrow and anticipation. He didn't weep immediately. Instead, he moved toward the study, opening drawers, rifling through papers. He paused occasionally, lifting a family photo, tracing fingers over the frame as though it could summon memory or guilt, and then pocketed a small envelope marked "Margaret's Jewelry." His younger sister, Lisa, arrived next, her designer handbag slung carelessly over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the shelves with barely disguised excitement. She sighed, pretending to mourn, but Margaret, hidden behind a carefully installed camera in the corner, caught the sparkle of greed in her eyes. The living room, once filled with laughter and warmth, now reeked of calculation. They began dividing her possessions immediately. Richard insisted that the antique clock in the hallway belonged to him, citing some vague story about how he had helped repair it once. Lisa claimed the silver cutlery, noting loudly that she had always admired it during family dinners. Their conversations, carefully observed, dripped with entitlement. Margaret could feel a bitter taste rise in her throat. Every smile, every polite nod, every feigned sigh of grief was nothing but a veneer, a shallow performance designed to conceal their anticipation for what would soon be theirs. Margaret's heart ached, not from the sight of their greed alone, but from the realization of how far her children had strayed from the values she had instilled. They were so focused on possessions that they didn't even pause to consider the emptiness of the house, the void left by her absence. She remembered each scraped knee, each midnight lullaby, each whispered word of comfort she had offered, and now she was just a ghost to them, a stepping stone in their pursuit of material gain. Thomas, lurking in the shadows beside her concealed vantage point, whispered, "Are you ready for the next stage?" Margaret nodded, though a tremor ran through her hand. The next stage had to be perfect, the crescendo of revelation timed to hit at the most dramatic moment. That moment would come at the meeting they had scheduled with the family attorney the following day, a meeting she had subtly manipulated them into believing was to discuss the distribution of her estate. Little did they know, Margaret had arranged every detail. Cameras in the study, the living room, and even the garden captured every expression, every sly smirk, every whispered negotiation. As the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Margaret moved carefully to a hidden room she had prepared, watching her children from behind a mirrored wall. She could see them discussing strategies, debating who would inherit what, each vying to secure the most valuable item.
The attorney's office was sleek, modern, and deliberately intimidating. Leather chairs, glass walls, and the subtle hum of air conditioning created an atmosphere of sterile professionalism. Margaret's children entered first, their steps confident, their smiles tight. They didn't know that cameras had already been placed throughout the office, disguised as smoke detectors, wall panels, and even the decorative plants in the corners. Every inch had been orchestrated to capture their true selves, unfiltered and raw. Richard took a seat at the head of the table, acting as if he were already the heir apparent, while Lisa perched near him, her nails tapping rhythmically on the polished surface. Their conversation was polite in tone, but sharp in content, betraying the desperation beneath their calm exteriors. "We need to finalize Mom's estate quickly," Richard said. "The sooner we sign, the better for both of us." Lisa nodded, flipping through a stack of papers with feigned interest. "I've reviewed the property documents. I think we can negotiate the division without too much conflict. After all, we know what's valuable." The attorney, a stern man named Mr. Jacobs, glanced at his watch and then at the stack of files in front of him. "Shall we proceed with the formalities?" he asked. Margaret, hidden behind a concealed panel at the back of the room, held her breath. Thomas, standing just out of sight, whispered, "Now, the moment is perfect." The children didn't notice her approaching the office door. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she entered, every movement calm, deliberate, almost regal. Her appearance was flawless, soft but commanding, her eyes bright with an intensity that seemed to pierce the room. She smiled faintly, a smile that held both warmth and warning. "Mom," Richard's voice cracked as he stood, shock overtaking the anticipation that had filled his expression moments before. Lisa froze, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, a hand clutching at her handbag as if it could shield her from the truth. Margaret's gaze swept across the room, taking in the incredulity, the panic, the realization that her mother had been watching all along. "Yes, it's me," she said softly, but with an edge that made their hearts skip a beat, alive and very much observing. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, in a surge of confusion and fear, Richard stammered, We thought you're—" "I was gone," Margaret interrupted, her voice calm but firm, "but only to see the truth, to understand what my children valued most, and now I see clearly. Not the family, not the love I gave freely, but money, possessions, and self-interest." Lisa's face flushed crimson. "Mom, it's not like that. We were just planning to divide my home while I was supposedly dead." Margaret's eyes flashed. "I watched you today and I watched you yesterday. Every glance, every whispered word, every move to claim what you thought was mine. And now you are confronted with the consequences of your choices." The attorney shifted uncomfortably, realizing this was far beyond the ordinary estate meeting. Margaret turned to him, her expression unyielding. "Mr. Jacobs, I instructed my friend to document everything. Every action, every word, every betrayal is recorded." Richard tried to reach for the documents, to salvage some semblance of control, but Margaret's presence was like a wall. "Do not touch them," she said sharply. "These are not just papers. These are proof of your true priorities." Lisa, panic rising, whispered, "Richard, what do we do?" Margaret's gaze softened just slightly, almost mournful. "You will understand in time that greed has consequences. The world will know what kind of children you are, and I will decide what justice looks like." The tension in the room was unbearable. Richard and Lisa exchanged frantic glances, realizing the inheritance they thought was theirs to fight over might never come at all, or worse, might land them in legal trouble. Every camera captured their expressions, the shock, the fear, the sudden guilt that couldn't be hidden behind carefully practiced smiles. Then Margaret delivered the final.
The moment Margaret stepped out of the attorney's office, the world seemed to pause. Outside, the city hummed with its usual rhythm, oblivious to the storm she had just orchestrated. But inside, the ripples of her actions were already spreading. Richard and Lisa were left behind, seated at the sleek conference table, their faces pale, their hands shaking, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear, shame, and disbelief. They had always assumed they could manipulate the world, twist reality to suit their desires, and exploit anyone they trusted. But reality had a way of breaking through facades, and Margaret had made sure it did, spectacularly. The footage of their greed and betrayal was no longer confined to hidden cameras. Thomas, with meticulous precision, had begun distributing copies to key people in their social and professional circles. Within hours, friends, business partners, and extended family members were watching the evidence. The reactions were instantaneous and brutal. Gasps, murmurs, and messages flooded in. Comments like, "I can't believe they would do that to their mother. That's unforgivable." And "Where did they learn such cruelty?" spread across group chats, emails, and social media. Richard's colleagues at work began whispering about his character, questioning his integrity, his empathy, his very nature. Lisa found herself receiving cold, distant messages from friends who had once been close, all expressing shock at her behavior. Meanwhile, Margaret returned home, the house now eerily quiet. She walked through the rooms with a sense of reclaiming space, a territory that had been taken for granted for years. The furniture, the walls, the memories, they all belonged to her, yet until now she had been a silent observer in her own life. She felt a profound sense of liberation, a weight lifted that she hadn't realized she had carried for decades. For once, she didn't have to please, negotiate, or sacrifice. The world would have to adapt to her terms, not the other way around. In the days that followed, the children attempted to defend themselves. Richard issued statements claiming misunderstandings, insisting he had meant no disrespect, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. Lisa attempted tearful apologies, claiming she had lost herself in the excitement of financial gain. But the evidence was undeniable. Margaret's recordings, perfectly timed, perfectly clear, left no room for excuses. Friends, family, and legal authorities could see exactly what had happened. Their credibility was shattered. The public fallout was staggering. The story made its way to local news outlets, framed as a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. Headlines blared, "Mother fakes death, exposes children's greed," "Family betrayal caught on camera," "Inheritance lessons, a 65-year-old woman's revenge." Social media erupted with viral clips from the recordings showing Richard laughing as he pocketed jewelry, Lisa arguing over a vase, the sheer casualness with which they divided their mother's possessions. Public sentiment overwhelmingly sided with Margaret, praising her courage, her intelligence, and her meticulous orchestration of justice. The legal consequences began to mount. Lawyers contacted the children, warning of potential lawsuits, questioning their entitlement to any inheritance given their documented behavior. Financial institutions froze accounts temporarily as investigations began. Even within the extended family, trust was fractured. Cousins, aunts, uncles, people who had once been passive observers began taking sides, some shunning the children outright. The ripple effect Margaret had anticipated was a tidal wave. But Margaret's focus wasn't vengeance alone. She wanted transformation, or at least awareness. She began holding conversations with her children, not as a punitive mother, but as a guiding presence demanding reflection. "Do you understand now what your actions say about you?" she asked Richard one afternoon. "Do you see that love isn't transactional and respect isn't negotiable?" Richard could only shake his head, words failing him, caught between shame and anger. Lisa cried, acknowledging for the first time the depth of her selfishness, but even that remorse was tinged with fear of public exposure. Margaret also took steps to protect herself, her finances, and her future. She revised her will, placing assets in a trust she controlled, ensuring no one could exploit her generosity again. She donated selectively, giving to charities that mattered to her, to causes that reflected the values she had lived by all her life. And she began reconnecting with friends, communities, and hobbies. In the quiet that followed the chaos, Margaret finally allowed herself to feel the weight of freedom she had long been denied. Her children, humbled and exposed, were left to grapple with the consequences of their choices, their once unquestioned sense of entitlement now fractured. For the first time, they understood that wealth and possessions could never replace the trust, love, and respect they had taken for granted. Margaret walked through her home, touching the familiar walls, the furniture, the trinkets she had once silently given away, now hers in every sense. The house, once a stage for greed, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where she could reclaim her life, her joy, her peace. Each room whispered memories of decades spent nurturing, sacrificing, and forgiving, and now those memories belonged to her, untainted and honored. The world outside, too, had seen the truth. Friends, neighbors, even strangers had watched the story unfold, a viral testament to the power of courage, intelligence, and self-respect. Margaret had been invisible for years, yet now her presence resonated far beyond the walls of her home. She had not only exposed the greed of those closest to her, but had rewritten the rules of her life, proving that dignity and agency could never be stolen. Sitting in her garden as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret finally allowed herself a deep, cleansing breath. The wind rustled through the trees, the golden light reflecting in her eyes, and for the first time in decades, she felt truly seen, truly free, and truly alive. She had orchestrated the ultimate lesson, not through anger, not through revenge, but through clarity, patience, and unwavering self-respect. Margaret's story, her triumph over betrayal, and her reclamation of life became a quiet legend in her community. And though her children would carry the mark of their choices for years to come, Margaret herself walked forward with a serene smile, a heart unburdened, and a life finally lived for her, by her, and on her own terms. The mother who had once been invisible had returned, and nothing would ever make her invisible again.